Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your sci-fi sommelier, your viceroy of verisimilitude, your master of fun and wonder, your existential Mr. Rogers. I would be, of course, Robert Meyer Burnett, and welcome to this Robservations episode number 337, Season 2, Robcasting at you from the Robservatory. And boy, what a show I've got for you today. It's pretty much like every other day, but different. It's the show about something, after all. And I want to begin this shindig with something interesting. So back on Robservations episode number 333, I covered a Hollywood Reporter article that talked about people of color, people who have different kinds of skin and hair and their requirements on set that aren't being met usually in Hollywood. And it was interesting because I found it, from a producing standpoint, something I hadn't really considered and I hadn't really thought about. And I was actually quite touched and moved by a lot of people that reached out to me for bringing up this topic. And for me, I really was interested in that. It was something that never really occurred to me. Now, I have known, obviously, being on sets for the last 30 years, that the people of different skin tones, when they're in the same scene together, can be difficult to light. It's something you don't really think about, but it's true. It happens. And that is a practical issue that comes up on set. Well, one of the things that I've often talked about when I delve into, I guess, political or social issues is I'm a staunch believer in the human race. And I'm also a staunch believer in the only way we're going to get to know one another is if we share stories. We have to tell stories because stories define us, and they sort of put into context our experiences. Now, I'm not a believer. I think one of the things that I think is often lost in the discussion about race and things like that it isn't just about someone's color. It's about someone's life experiences based on their external, what people think of them. I mean, obviously, the racial differences in America were based externally on color. But really, when you're talking about if we want to have true equality, we need to understand the experiences that, because of someone's color, what life experiences were forced upon them, or what life experiences did they have. The only way to understand our different experiences is to understand what people have gone through. I mean, it's all great that we want to have equality for people of all colors, but unless you understand their experience of life because of their external appearance and what has happened to them, you're never going to have true equality because no one's ever really going to understand it. And I didn't bring up the topic in episode 333 about hair on set, black hair on set or black skin on set, because I was interested in necessarily some social justice warrior aspect of the world. But no, it was more of a practical issue. And the idea that if you have a cast, especially the women in your cast, women of all shapes, sizes, colors, creeds, I don't care who they are or what they look like, what they need to know is that they look good when they walk out on set, so they can concentrate on their artistry, their performance. And the first line of defense of that is, in fact, making sure that you have great hair and makeup people. Great hair and makeup people are the first line of defense. And it never occurred to me, really, that there was a lack of hair and makeup people that are experienced dealing with the hair of people of color, or the facial makeup. It's just something I didn't really consider. And when I read that article, because also I was tying it into the fact that, yes, it was Black History Month, but I didn't need to bring that up necessarily. But also there was a charming short nominated for an Academy Award, which won, about a black father trying to deal with his young daughter's hair. And I thought, what an interesting topic to discuss. What I did not expect was the deluge of either thank yous or just interesting commentary I got on people. I leave my DMs open on Twitter, so you can DM me, and I was touched by it. But I have to say, one of the people that touched me the most in terms of their reaching out to me was Christopher Fagan from Texas. And I've always said to people, if you would like to make videos or things, please do so. I'm happy to play them. And Christopher sent me an amazing video. It's 8 minutes long, but I encourage everybody to watch this. And I can't thank him enough for reaching out. And to me, if anything exemplifies what I'm hoping to accomplish with this show, I think Christopher's video is certainly one of those things. So take it away, sir.
Well, prepare yourself, guys. My name is Christopher Fagan from Talking Through the Media's YouTube channel, and I want to thank you, Robert Meyer Burnett, for inviting me onto your channel to discuss something that was very surprising to me that just like you, I was not aware of until it was brought to my attention. When you did the report about women in the movie business, African-American women in the movie business that are afraid sometimes to make waves and ask for hairstylists for hair and makeup that are familiar with and trained to do our type of hair, it resonated with me because, for one, I felt like, why was I not aware of this earlier? Obviously, this is something that was probably been an issue for some people, a lot of people in Hollywood. And I was so shocked that it just came to my attention probably right when it came to your attention. Well, I found out about it for the first time when you reported on it. But it spoke to something that I've reported on my channel a couple of times. I myself used to work overseas for the military, and my experience with the black females in the military who were fighting to change a few of the rules pertaining to their hair and how they're treated. For long story short, to have one day off of every week, a woman of color in the military would have to take that whole day to get the little resources that they could together, find other people who were trained in doing their hair, and take the time to relax their hair or get their hair into compliance so they wouldn't find themselves in trouble. Where other women in the military who were not African American would be allowed to just go about their day, enjoy their days off. Usually 9 times out of 10, a person in a war zone, a female in a war zone of color, would have to spend their whole day off trying to get themselves and their hair into compliance, into the dress code. So why do I bring this up? Well, if you saw the Oscars, which I know you did, you saw that DeAndre Arnold was honored by the creators, Matthew Cherry, who created Hair Love and won Best Short Film for an animation, and brought him on stage, and he became an activist in this movement based on what happened to him here in Texas from his high school, who they told him that he was going to be suspended, not allowed to graduate if he did not cut his hair. Now, he has his hair style based on his culture, his family culture. But according to the school, they say that boys were not allowed to have their hair at a certain length, at a certain style. Girls were allowed to do it, but not boys. And a lot of miscommunication has been going on throughout Houston. Even on a local radio station, there was discussions about this, and it's being said that the boy should not be rewarded by getting on all these shows, Ellen, Gabrielle Union, and what have you, because he was breaking the rules. Well, in reality, this school's change of dress code was done in the middle of the school year, and he was 6 months away from graduating. Now, the reason why I brought that up, because it was all tied into what you were saying on your show. And again, I want to thank you for bringing it up, because like I said, I was totally unaware of that. But the second you reported it, I was like, wow, it's obvious that's probably been going on, especially with an actress having to say something like, I was afraid to mention it or to say something to a director or to a producer because I don't want to be labeled as being difficult. But it only will help make your projects better if you are allowing your talent to be taken care of and to present themselves and look their best the way they know how to look their best, because it would only, like you said, benefit the movie as a whole. So why not have the hairstylists, hair makeup that know how to handle our types of hair? Now, obviously, bald by choice, I don't have that problem, but I think of my children a lot. I have two boys and one girl, and their hair is grown out. I come up with this scenario a lot. Let's keep it to the school level, just like what DeAndre Arnold went through, where you have let's keep it to my daughter. You have one little girl who is white, and then one little girl like my daughter who is black, and they go to bed before school. They get ready to go to school. When they wake up the next day, they wake up. They don't take a brush or anything to their hair, and they just go to school the way God made them. And they get dressed. They head to school, and at the end of the day, the parents find out that one little girl was out of compliance and one little girl was in compliance based on the rules that were set for them both. Now, my daughter's hair, if left alone, not braided or anything, no chemicals or anything like that, will poof up and go up. Another little girl's hair will naturally fall down. And to be told that you are wrong and this other person is right is something that has got to change in the way we talk to people of color. Because both little girls in this scenario did the exact same thing. They went to bed, they woke up, went to school, and went there the way God made them. And to be told you are right and another person you are wrong is not right. And it's heartbreaking. I myself, when I had hair, remember my grandmother getting me ready for school one day and trying to get my hair ready before she had to go to work, and would say out loud, we gotta comb this bad hair. I remember, I think Chris Rock made a film about it's called Good Hair, I believe. This is something that has been going on for generations, and for as far back as you can remember, as you know, if you read the history in this country, where at first it was people who do not share these characteristics telling another group of people that is ugly or that is wrong or that is bad, and then they grow up and have children of their own and then spread the same message, where all the way down to 1980 something, when I was a little kid, my own grandmother, and then it's to a point where they don't mean it in that way. It's just so ingrained that this is right and this is wrong that they will say it out loud. I gotta comb this bad hair. And I'm so glad that messages like what you were giving on your channel, and messages of like body shaming and image and things like that, where people are being told there's nothing wrong with you. Do not be ashamed. Do not let anybody else tell you that you are out of compliance. Thank you, Robert Meyer Burnett, once again for allowing me to crash your Robservation. I hope I stayed objective. Huh? You see what I did there? Yeah, you get it. And again, this is Christopher Fagan. We're talking through the medias, and I appreciate your time. This has been a obsession of mine to collaborate with you. I'm out of here, guys. Peace, brother. Thank you.
Robjective. Well, I want to thank Christopher, first of all, for taking the time even to make that great video. But what really struck me about that is, if nothing else, the YouTube punditry community, the people that are going online and analyzing entertainment and things like that, we're all part of this ecosystem that I think in the long run is ultimately a positive thing. And I really appreciated Christopher reaching out, also because I didn't know anything about the military experience for women or people of color in terms of having to spend your one day off in war zones trying to figure out how to keep your hair in compliance with military rules. And again, this is a practical issue that a lot of people, would never, I certainly wouldn't have known this. And that's how we are really going to understand and respect, I think, differences of all people. I mean, this is a practical issue of day-to-day existence that I don't have to deal with, that somebody else has to deal with as a matter of course, just because of the way they were born. And I thought Christopher's, I really appreciate this video, and I thought he did a great job. And it's amazing. It's amazing. This is what movies can do. This is what entertainment and pop culture can do. It can start these conversations, and I think it's great. And that's, again, when I say to people, every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. And all you have to do is listen. I absolutely believe it. And I want to thank Christopher for reaching out. I believe Christopher lives in Texas. And how great was that? And I can't thank him enough for the contribution to the show and for contributing again. Somebody I didn't know who had a story to tell that I had yet to hear, and I listened to it. And now I think I have a new friend in Christopher. And I invite him to write back and send videos anytime. And again, Christopher contacted me over Twitter. So if you want to DM me or you have videos that you want to make, I'm happy to play them on the show. You can also contact me through the website down there, the Burnettwork.net, where you can send me letters and things. And I'm back on the letter tip today, ladies and gentlemen, just so you know. Now, I was thinking about horror. Horror as a genre, I've loved my whole life. As a matter of fact, this book, it's as mint as I could have kept it. It's pretty mint. It has a bro dart on it. Stephen King's nonfiction book, Danse Macabre. This is my copy I bought off the shelf in 1981. And because, for the most part, I used to be, well, I still kind of am, but very obsessive. This has, of course, a bro dart on it. That's why it's shiny, to keep the dust jacket pretty much as close to mint as a book that is 39 years old can be. Now, I must have read, I look at Steve King back in the day. Look at him. Look at him. Look at that beard. I probably read this book 100 times. I love this book. And this is a nonfiction book on Stephen King's musings on horror. And he talks about his favorite horror films. And I mean, I have always loved the horror genre since I was a little kid. And I think one of the interesting things about horror, at least to me, as a genre, whether it's literary, whether you're watching a movie, or you're watching a TV show, or reading a novel, because I've read a lot of horror novels in my time, I've always thought of horror as one of the most moral of all genres, even though horrible shit happens. People get eviscerated. And if you read serial killer novels, I mean, the stuff that they do to people, horrible, right? But in the end, the horror genre really is about maintaining your humanity in the face of even a cosmic onslaught from a Lovecraftian, like Cthulhu, and his compatriots, or its compatriots. And I've always liked that about horror. And there's something like, you go back to something like Clive Barker's Hellraiser films. The Cenobites didn't show up and torment people just because. We as human beings had to summon them. As we saw in the first horror film, or the first Hellraiser, Frank Cotton was a man he couldn't get enough physical experience. Nothing was, even boning his brother's wife and proving to himself that he was the greatest lay of her life. Even that wasn't enough. So he had to open the lament configuration, the puzzle box, and summon the demons from hell, the Cenobites themselves, to take him to satisfy his carnal and insane desires. And look where that led to him. They tore his soul apart. And I think that horror has always interested me in relation to human behavior. And what does it all mean? And I think ultimately we have in our own lives the built-in specter of death. That I mean, you're born, you're going to die. There's nothing you can do about it. However, much of the horror genre has been obsessed with death and what happens after death, whether you're ghosts or whether you're a vampire and you're undead. And I mean, it's all derived out of our own predilections and our own thoughts and our own mortality. And I've always loved the horror genre. Of course, I love everything that comes along with it. I do love monsters and werewolves and vampires and The Thing or a xenomorph. I mean, Alien's a horror film after all. Indeed, it's science fiction as well. But I've always loved the genre. Now, for the most part, it's not exactly a genre that is held in high regard by most people. You know, it's easily dismissed. But I really love my highbrow horror. And when I say, what do I mean by highbrow horror? I think Rosemary's Baby is highbrow horror. The Exorcist is highbrow horror. I mean, do I love my Hammer movies? Sure. When they celebrate horror tropes. Do I love Vampire Circus? Absolutely. Other horror films like Videodrome, body horror. I really love body horror. The idea, again, because our bodies ultimately fail us. And the whole idea of body horror, we just bring that failure sooner. And that's why I loved David Cronenberg so much. His early features, Shivers or They Came From Within, Rabid, The Brood, Scanners, Videodrome, and all the way through things like Dead Ringers and Crash. He was always dealing with the fact that our bodies could revolt against us. We are spiritual, intellectual beings that are housed in this cranium where our minds or souls or whatever reside. But what happens in, like, say, The Fly, when an experiment goes awry and you get merged with an actual housefly and your body begins to mutate and there's nothing you can do about it. Your intellect remains as your body literally revolts, comes out from under you. And what's more horrific than that? But it's something that allegorically we have to deal with, whether you develop a melanoma or terminal cancer or cirrhosis of the liver that I'll probably wind up suffering from one day. Whatever that is, it's the fact that your intellect is being destroyed by the very physical thing that has provided life to that intellect. And I've always loved these issues. And again, I love stories about human monsters, serial killers, that pathology. How did it arise? And of course, another thing that the man next door or the woman next door might be a monster. And that was something that my man Stephen King sort of pioneered. I mean, sure, Ira Levin was writing Rosemary's Baby in the 60s, and there was those kinds of horror films. The Exorcist being one of another spiritual horror. The idea that what does the afterlife provide? There is Satan. If there is God, there is Satan. And the idea that you're going to be damned for all eternity because of what you've done on earth. All of these things are just rich material from which to delve into, well, storytelling. And again, I think my favorite horror film of all time, and I'm not even a very spiritual person, I would call myself a universalist. I believe in the cosmos, and the great whatever is out there is out there. And that's why, like the Swedish science fiction film Inaria, I've never seen a better cinematic example of what happens when when you gaze into the abyss gazes back into you. The Swedish science fiction film that came out in 2019 is the best example of that. It's a low-budget, beautifully made science fiction film that really had a profound impact on me when it was over. And Elizabeth said to me, she's like, "Why are we watching this? Why did you make me watch that?" It's a Swedish film. I mean, it follows in the grand tradition of Bergman, let me tell you. If Bergman made a science fiction film, he might have made Inaria. But that whole idea always has interested me. And again, I really like philosophical horror, and I really like, horror to me also is about what's it like having to live another day in the world that we live in. I myself have been noodling with this horror script for a very long period of time, and the devil is a character in it, but you don't know that. It's implied, but he is, and or it is, but in my case, it's a he, and I've always loved the genre in all of its myriad forms, and I find it very interesting because horror fans in real life are some of like the nicest and most creative people that I know. I mean, science fiction fans are a well, we can be a snarly bunch, a surly bunch if we want to be. But I've actually found horror fans, and I know a lot of them. There's a large horror community in LA, and they always turn out for screenings, or if there's a convention about haunted houses, as there is in the summer, they'll turn out for that. We also have Monster Palooza here, and for the most part, my horror film fans, my horror fans are, or horror fan friends, are the nicest bunch of people you ever shall meet. You will shall ever meet. And it's funny, I guess because there's something inherently life-affirming, I think, about being a horror fan. I mean, it's not like you're a thuggy death cult and you're worshiping. It's not like you want to get... You're in no hurry to get to the afterlife, let me tell you. But I think that there's something cathartic in being a horror fan. Well, anyway, so I found this, as I am wont to do. I'm always scouring the internet for articles or thoughts or what people have to say about things. And I think I wanted to start out, since I was talking about, our main man, Steve K. I found this article, which I thought was interesting. I was looking for my glasses. Where did I put them? They're right here. I'm going to have to put them on. Excuse me. These are my just cheap-ass $5 glasses. Stephen King's 3 Levels of Horror. And this was posted on August 27th, 2019. And it was on Regal, I guess is Regal Theaters, which I thought was interesting. For decades, Stephen King has been the mastermind behind some of the best-selling horror novels in the genre, starting with his debut and arguably most reputable novel from 1974, Carrie. I don't think it's his most reputable novel. He has been a whirlwind of creation, having written over 200 novels and short stories to date, and gaining enormous popularity from book lovers and horror fans, as well as acquiring the attention of movie makers, most recently in the 2-part adaptation of his novel, It. Ready or Not, the perfect balance of comedy and horror. No matter what era, King has been able to terrorize readers through words and paint haunting imagery that stays with us long after we've put the book down. Many writers have tried to imitate his writing style, but have met with little success. So what is it about King's writings that captivates and torments us so much? According to the acclaimed author, there are 3 levels of horror: the gross out, horror, and terror. It is these elements that allow the genre to be diversely shocking and hypnotizing in not only literature, but in cinema as well. The gross out. This is the act of physically revolting your audience. The excessive blood you find in Blumhouse movies, the grotesque animation of The Thing, or as King puts it, the sight of a severed hand tumbling down a flight of stairs. Put more simply, it's the ew factor that we experience when witnessing the more gruesome scenes in movies. King has explained this to be his lowest tier of the 3 levels, but some may argue that it is the gross out that has led to the success of such movies as Saw and Hostel. I disagree with that statement, by the way. I think the success of Saw and Hostel has more to do with the actual premise of each film. The gore is certainly awesome, and I love. Look, we all like great kills in horror movies. Who doesn't? I was talking on the John Campea show this morning about the kills in Final Destination, but I think Saw and Hostel both have what I would like to say a philosophy. It's in Videodrome. I talk about it all the time. Max Wren, James Woods' character, is looking for this show Videodrome that basically is just torture. And one of his compatriots, this older woman who's in love with him, who finds information about Videodrome for him, says, "Don't look for Videodrome, Max. Don't look for it because it has a philosophy," as all great horror does. And I think that while gross out is great, why I like movies like Saw and Hostel, especially I would say Hostel 2, which I think is better than Hostel 1, is because of the philosophy. The second level of horror, according to King, the horror. On the second tier is the horror or the graphic portrayal of the unbelievable. This occurs when the audience is faced with something that strikes up genuine fear, typically caused by the sight of something so implausible or unnatural that their minds struggle to grasp with what they're seeing. An example of this, as Stephen King would put it, would be spiders the size of bears. I never want to see that. I know where he's coming from. The dead waking up and walking around. It's when the lights go out and something with claws grabs you by the arm. A more relevant example would be the scene in It, where Pennywise shifts his form to manifest the fears of the Losers Club. And then finally, The third level of horror, the terror. Finally, according to King, at the highest, and as he explains, the worst level of fear is terror. This is where the master of horror shines the most. This is where the induction of fear is solely caused by the imagination. This is perfectly crafted for literary use, as the images being created lie entirely in the reader's mind. All an author has to do is simply suggest the unknown, and the reader will fill in the blanks with something truly terrifying. A chilling illustration of terror by King is when you come home and notice everything you own had been taken away and replaced by an exact substitute. It's when your lights go out and you feel something behind you. You hear it, you feel its breath against your ear, but when you turn around, there's nothing there. Ultimately, the overlying theme of creating authentic horror is to provide an audience with something that they cannot completely understand. When we are faced with chaos, we become terrified, or as Stephen King would put it, it's not just the physical or mental aberration in itself which horrifies us, but the lack of order which these aberrations seem to imply. Now, this article obviously was in support of It Chapter 2, but, it's always interesting to hear someone like King wax rhapsodic about the different kinds of horror. And I think that last comment that he made about the fear of disorder, that is certainly one of my greatest fears. And I think that's why I was so taken by Romero's Dawn of the Dead when I saw it back in 1979 when it opened. Yes, I know, 78, it was playing places, but it didn't really open nationally until 1979. Boy, can I not wait for that Second Sight Blu-ray set. My God, wow. Bet you by golly wow, as Prince would sing. Can't wait. But anyway, I loved Dawn of the Dead for that reason. I mean, the downfall of civil society. And of course, the zombie hordes are a metaphor for any, the Visigoths coming over into Rome and destroying order and this great civilization. I mean, I saw that one of the thing that was so horrible to me about 9/11, I think 9/11 was actually the first time, or the time I've most been scared in my life, because it was a manifestation of that kind of chaos. Because that there were people out there that not only did the Twin Towers represent New York City, but they represented all of human civilization, all of our mathematics and science and technology, and both the planes that were destroyed and the buildings that came down, not to mention the horrible loss of life. But the idea that there are forces out there, human beings, that would much rather destroy a city like New York City, burn it to the ground. If they could, they would have crashed buildings into every one of those formidable towers in the city that never sleeps. But they didn't offer anything in return. They offer, I don't know, an afterlife. They offer a belief system. But they're willing to destroy, those people were willing to destroy everything that human beings have achieved, metaphorically, as exemplified by the Twin Towers and the planes that flew into them. That was the height of what human beings were able to accomplish. And it was torn down in an instant. And what was the replacement? There wasn't one. And that to me that's a future that mankind is this far away from. And I think maybe that's why I love post-apocalyptic stories, because they too embrace the horror. But anyway, there's a lot of debate and discussion amongst horror fans today about what their favorite kinds of horror movies are. Like, I've told people that I really loved, Robert Eggers movies. And Robert Eggers, of course, famously had The Lighthouse come out this year, which is only his second film. And his first film was The Witch, a movie that I absolutely adored. So what I started to do, and I don't know why I was doing this, but I was like, what? Has anyone written an analysis on The Witch, or written an analysis on The Lighthouse, and what it all means? And is The Lighthouse a horror film? And I maintain that it absolutely is a horror film. Now, as a film, is it, say, as delicious to watch as, I don't know, Silence of the Lambs, or A Nightmare on Elm Street, or, I don't know, pick your favorite horror movie. I really like Stuart Gordon's Reanimator. It's the great comedic and also very serious, and it deals with those great themes all melded into one. But the Lighthouse is a challenging movie. But what is the Lighthouse about, really? And I think it's about madness. It's about the human mind becoming detached from itself. And of course, the milieu is something that we've never seen before. And Robert Eggers and his collaborators, what they did was they painstakingly researched the dialect of the time, the wiki. They really created a world that I've never seen on film before. Other than the song "I Want to Marry a Lighthouse Keeper," from Clockwork Orange. What do I know about lighthouses? I know that Stevie Wayne broadcasts from her lighthouse for KAB, Antonio Bay. I know that, but I've never. The loneliness and the I guess the existential despair that you would feel living in a lighthouse was sort of encompassed in that movie. And of course, madness takes over, and your dreams of, your fantasies maybe of finding a mermaid, all of those things, and playing into the paranoia of wondering, what is your compatriot doing up in that lighthouse tower when he's in the light? What's going on up there? I mean, it was a slow burn, but the atmosphere that it cast, and I love all of that. And I really think that we're in we're in a terrific period of time for horror in terms of the kind of horror that I really love. I mean, finally, my beloved Second Sight. Let's see, where is it? Yes. One of my favorite horror movies, in addition to Robert Eggers' The Witch, is The Invitation, which this is from Second Sight, and it's I finally got a Blu-ray of this. This is Karen Kusama's movie. She directed another fantastic movie recently with Nicole Kidman called Destroyer that I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. But this is kind of this is right up my alley. I mean, might be my favorite horror film of the last 10 years, but because there's nothing to be afraid of, as it says on the cover. I love this film because it has that kind of, it's got the horror next door. You don't really know what's going on, and when things start to be revealed, you realize that human beings can be the greatest monsters of all. And it's just a movie about a dinner party. And by the way, if you've never seen The Invitation, or you don't know anything about The Invitation, I think it's on Netflix. Don't read anything about it. Don't watch a trailer. Just sit down and you tell people that the Viceroy of Verisimilitude sent you and told you not to watch it. I mean, not of course, watch it. Don't read anything about it. Don't find anything else about it. Don't. But anyway, so I know that a lot of people, even horror fans, were very divided about something like The Lighthouse, as they were on The Witch. And I was like, why are they so divided about this? Well, I did find an article. It doesn't really talk about the Lighthouse, because it hadn't been made yet, but it talks about Robert Eggers, and I want to share it with you. But first, let me just jump in to see what people have to say here. There's been a lot of people who have written in. Willow sent in a tip and said, I loved Mads Mikkelsen in The Hunt. It's a very different role from the villains he usually plays. I also thought the movie dealt with some really tough questions about dealing with sexual abuse allegations without destroying innocent people's lives. Well, Willow, I don't know if you wrote, I think you did write about us. Did you write about it on the John Campy show? What Willow is talking about is a Danish movie called The Hunt that deals with that. It deals with the specter of sexual abuse and allegations and what they can do to somebody's life, whether they're true or not. It's a terrific film, and Mads Mikkelsen is front and center. And the guy is just an amazing actor. First of all, I love his face. I love his accent. I just love watching him. Never more so than in Brian Fuller's superlative, and I would dare say the greatest horror show ever, that deals with all the things that I love. Existential dread. It deals with all kinds of deviant behavior and all the things we don't want to ever admit that are going on. It's fan-fucking-tastic. If you guys haven't seen Hannibal, now, if you've seen Red Dragon, and you've seen Silence of the Lambs, and you've seen Hannibal, and you've seen Hannibal Rising, and you've even seen Brett Ratner's Red Dragon, I cannot recommend Hannibal enough. It is a really interesting way to take some things that have been well trodden, ground that has been well trodden, and do something unique and new. And wow, it's so great. So yeah, Willow, I agree with you about The Hunt. Mark C sent in a super chat and says, Mark C says, Rob, I worked on a low-budget film starring Vivica A. Fox. She brought her own makeup people. It took 4 hours not to look like a zombie or monster, just to look like Vivica A. Fox. Nice lady, though. I got to direct Vivica A. Fox. Vivica Fox in one of my episodes of Femme Fatales, and I loved her. I love working with her. She was hilarious. And if you ever see one of my episodes of Femme Fatales that Vivica Fox is in, I would encourage you to watch it. But yes, Vivica Fox, look, I mean, she's a very beautiful woman. She wants to know she looks good. I hope that the movie that you worked on, I hope they gave her time to look that way. Again, Vivica Fox will deliver the goods. She wants to make sure that she looks the way she's supposed to look when she steps out onto set. It's great. Look, it's great that the production allowed her to bring her own hair and makeup people. Mark C. sent in another super chat. Tim Miller's animation studio announced last summer they're making Eric Powell's zombie-killing mobster, The Goon, with 20th Century Fox. Any chance you've heard an update on the project? No, and I love The Goon. I think probably this is one of those projects like, I think, Mouse Guard, which was canceled. I was really looking forward to Mouse Guard from 20th Century Fox, and it got axed because of the acquisition, which, boy, what a bummer. So sorry to hear that. But I've not heard, Mark. Stubble McShave sends in a tip and says, I read Dan Wells' horror book, I Am Not a Serial Killer. I watched the was it Netflix show? I thought it was pretty good. On the airport while waiting for my flight, I got a few strange looks by people and realized that they probably thought I read a self-help book. Probably. Yeah, that's I like that. I like the show a lot. I haven't read the book, though. Zachary King sent in a super chat and says, Rob, do you think Disney will ever put the Fox catalog of movies on Disney Plus or any other streaming service? Yes, I do. There are Fox movies on Disney Plus, like things like The Sound of Music, for instance. But I think Disney Plus, they're going to keep it a family-friendly streaming service. I would imagine other Fox films are going to be probably put on Hulu, or maybe they'll eventually have an adjunct or some kind of other streaming service where they'll have those movies. Because, yeah, it's a deep, rich catalog. And I think that, and maybe classic Fox titles will wind up on Disney Plus. But I can't see, like I think All About Eve is Fox. I can't imagine All About Eve winding up on Disney Plus. Maybe it will, but I think that's what they're going to do. They're going to wait and put it on titles. They'll put it on Hulu or something like that. Zachary King sends in a $2 super chat as well and says, Rob, thanks for turning me on to Doomcock. Doomcock, amusing. Well, for those of you who don't know, I mean, Doomcock is one of the Fandom Menace channels, and I love me some Doomcock. Dichter von Doomcock, he lives at the center of the earth. He's a supervillain, and apparently, if you listen to his latest videos, he is not well liked by people like Alex Kurtzman over at Secret Hideout. Wow. And, you know, he's railing for great Star Trek, and anybody that wants great Star Trek is a friend of mine. Plus, he's funny. Does he go over the top sometimes? Sure. Can he be tiresome? Of course. But you know what? He's got a character and a persona, and I like it. I like it. I'm glad you do. Chris Rigglesworth sent in a super chat and says, horror story that has yet to be adapted, but you would love to see. I think I'm hoping for an adaptation of King's short story, The Jaunt. Ooh, that's a good one. You know, I in the Mountains of Madness, Guillermo del Toro's adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft, why somebody isn't making that, I don't know. I have a suspicion one day it's going to get made. You know, I was really excited to see like Dan Simmons' book, The Terror. Everyone knows I have a huge Dan Simmons fixation. Got turned into a miniseries, and then they spun it off and made the second season, which I thought it was not based on a book, but it was certainly tremendous. I really want to see if somebody said, Rob, if they came to me right now and they said, what would you make if you could do a genre-related property, a horror property, what would you do? And I think there are a couple things. The first thing that comes to mind right away is Glenn Duncan's novel, The Last Werewolf, which is actually now a trilogy of books. I'd make all three. The they're great. And if you want to read a great series of books, The Last Werewolf is it. Jonathan Mayberry's Joe Ledger series, which, by the way, they've tried to make into shows before. Now, Jonathan Mayberry, he has a show on Netflix now. He's one of my favorite modern horror authors. But his Joe Ledger series, basically, the Joe Ledger series combines military and action thriller stuff with all the different horror tropes. Vampires, genetic engineering, Cthulhu, aliens. I mean, I know it sounds crazy. Zombies. But he does a great job. It's basically about the DMS, the Department of Military Science, a government organization, a shadowy government organization that deals with basically like X-Files. But what's really interesting and what makes it so fun is that Jonathan Mayberry goes into every horror trope you can think of and makes it seem realistic. Like, where did zombies come from? Well, if you read Jonathan Mayberry's first Joe Ledger book, you'll find out. But, you know, they've got even great titles, like one of them is called The Extinction Machine. I mean, come on. What's not to love? I'd love to see those books adapted. I read a pilot was written. A friend of mine wrote a pilot for a Joe Ledger series back in 2010, but it was a procedural, and I thought it really... They should just... somebody should adapt each book as a season. I mean, it would take a long time, I guess, but... You know, each book is great. His latest book, which was good, but it wasn't one of my favorites. There's a big change that happened. It's called Rage. And if you haven't read Jonathan Mayberry's books before, don't start with Rage, because you really have needed to read the rest of them. But he's been putting them out steadily every year for the last decade, so I love those. But I think one of my most eagerly... There are two books that I've wanted to see made into movies, if I could... First of all, my dream project is Robert McCammon's They Thirst from 1981. It's a story about vampires completely taking over Los Angeles, and it's awesome, and I loved it. And also, John Skipp and Craig Spector, probably the king of the splatterpunk, kings or princes of the splatterpunk genre in the mid-'80s, their third book, The Scream. It's a little dated, obviously. You'd have to update it. The world's a little different now. But basically, The Scream in a nutshell was really about... It's about a band that really is... Well, maybe some of their members are really from hell. And what they're trying to do. And I know it sounds a little goofy. I love it. It's so good. It's so much fun if you want to read some great 80s horror. And, you know, I've got piles and piles of horror paperbacks here, like from the 80s, and if you're at all interested in a great overview of 80s horror, Grady Hendrix wrote a book called Paperbacks from Hell. On one hand, I love the book. It was a great overview. It's not as comprehensive as I would have liked, but it's a great overview of horror from the 70s and 80s. But what I didn't like about it is it made it impossible. I used to love to go to the local bookstores, like the Iliad bookstore, a great used bookstore, and find all of these great lurid covered paperbacks from the 80s. You can't do that anymore, because ever since Grady Hendrix's book came out, everybody's buying them. And hey, you know, I guess my adaptations of Halloween 3 and Videodrome are worth more money, but still, brah. Come on, man. No, it's good. Mark C. sent in another super chat saying, I feel like a relic. My love for horror is almost exclusively with the Universal Monsters, whether Make the Film or Hammer. Now, what Mark C. is referring to is Universal Monsters and then Hammer Horror, Hammer Studios, that I dearly love. I've covered their movies, the Quatermass movies here, but I always talk about their Vampire Circus. They did the Dracula movies with Christopher Lee, as many people have seen. I have a one-sheet for Dracula Has Risen from the Grave right next to a Belle de Jour one-sheet in my bedroom. I make no apologies for that. And I also, they made a lot of great horror films. The Karnstein trilogy, Twins of Evil, Lust for a Vampire, and The Vampire Lovers. Actually, I think it's reverse. I think it's The Vampire Lovers, Lust for a Vampire, and Twins of Evil. That's the proper order. They're great. And, you know, it's funny to me that a lot of modern horror fans don't dig Hammer. They don't like... They're low budget, and they're a little quaint. I totally get it. But you know what? I have great big love for Vampire Circus. I'm also a big fan of Jean Rollins' sort of lesbian vampire movies, trashy Euro vampire movies that are lyrical, but movies like Fascination and Lips of Blood, and also my favorite Jean Rollin movie is actually a zombie movie, The Living Dead Girl, which is actually very lyrical and poetic. There's so much great horror to find if you're really going to delve into it, and yeah. Evan Newman sends in a tip and says, said it before, but Invasion of the Body Snatchers 1978 and John Carpenter's The Thing make a great highbrow horror double feature. I totally agree. Philip Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978 is one of my very favorite horror films. And yes, sure, they came from beyond space. I get it, but it's definitely a horror film. It is a great study in paranoia, and it is hardly aged at all. My God. Both ask, who can you trust? Who are people underneath? Or, as the Thing's source material is titled, who goes there? Yes, Evan Newman, I totally agree with you 100%. Those are two fantastic horror films. I mean, one of the great things is if you haven't really delved into the canon of horror, you haven't looked into the classical films, there's so much to find. By the way, the number one horror film that I want to see is David Cronenberg's son's latest movie. I think his name it's Brandon Cronenberg, coming out of Sundance, his film Possessor. Oh my God, can I not wait to see this film. For those of you who might have missed it, his last film, Antiviral. Man, if you want to see a film that has a strange premise that's actually pretty well executed, I would encourage all of you to seek out Antiviral. Again, it's a strange one, but its premise, it's certainly, he does his father proud, but Possessor, just read any review and tell me it won't shoot to the top of your list too. And it will. I'm sure it will. Seduce Screening Room sent in a tip. Watching Missing Link and Folding Some Laundry. Really love the animation from Leica, like a souped-up claymation stop-motion movie with a really distinct artistic style. Sticking with the topic of your stream, you know of any animated horror films? Well, there's the what is it? The Mad Monster Party. You know, although it's a little comedic. Animated horror films. That's a good one. Well, there's like Japanese anime. Like I love. Well, it's a little hentai, but things like The Wandering Kid. If you haven't seen The Wandering Kid or Vampire Hunter D, there's a lot of great anime horror. Or forgive me, but yeah, I watched it. There's a Japanese animated series called Bible Black. Yeah, I know it's hentai. What can I tell you? But Bible Black, I did enjoy. So there's a lot of pretty hardcore Japanese animated horror. But yeah, Orville Nation sent in a super chat. Hey, Robert, sent you a panel invite to interview with Sci-Fi Icon through Twitter DM. Let me know if it interests you. Kind regards, PJ. Sure, absolutely. I'm sure it interests me. Bring it on. Evan Newman goes on and tips. He says, it seems to me the divide with horror fans is how one defines the word horror. I love The Witch, but when I walked out of it, people were commenting that it wasn't scary and they never jumped once. I think people forget that horror is a broad term. Yeah, well, that brings me, Evan, you brought me to the article that I would like to share that I found when looking up, and it speaks to horror fandom, and it also speaks to Mr. Eggers. And I think I want to jump right into it. It's a long article. Maybe I won't read the whole thing, but I want to read some of it. So here it is. This I found on Medium, and it is from Jason Kaufman from February 19th, 2016. Why We Can't Have Nice Things, The Witch, and Horror Fandom's Gatekeepers. The Witch, the debut feature film from writer-director Robert Eggers, premiered at the 2015 Sundance Film Festival, where it garnered huge acclaim for its painstakingly researched historical accuracy and won Eggers the festival awards for Best Director. Then it went on to win the Horror Jury Prize at 2015's Fantastic Fest in September, and shortly after the festival, its wide release was announced for 2016. To say that its release into the wider world was not anticipated by film fans in general and horror fans in particular is an understatement. If this narrative sounds familiar, it's because it's very similar to the release trajectory of two other high-profile genre releases, Jennifer Kent's The Babadook and David Robert Mitchell's It Follows. Also, I would add to that A Woman Walks Home Alone at Night, which is an Iranian horror film. Like The Witch, both of those films made big impressions on audiences at prominent festivals. The critical buzz started a wave of pre-release hype that had horror fans salivating at the chance to catch those films on the big screen. In a film landscape where studio horror has become increasingly dependent on cheap found footage productions, sequels, and the odd film based on a board game, horror fans are always on the lookout for something new, and these films promised just that. While many horror fans did enjoy these films, a vocal contingent very much did not. These viewers felt the films were overhyped and did not deliver on whatever they felt they had been promised by audiences who had seen the films during their festival run. Going further, some of these dissenters claimed that these weren't even horror movies at all, that they were boring and not scary, and that true horror fans would see through this charade, and only dilettantes and posers would have anything but disdain for them. Unsurprisingly, The Witch was met with the same reaction by many of the same viewers. What makes this exceptionally frustrating is not the fact of dissent itself. Anyone is entitled to their own opinion and feelings toward any film, but that the detractors have targeted 3 films that work within the genre, but are also examples of how genre cinema can explore concepts and themes in ways that less fantastic stories cannot. In short, the rejection of these films appears to people outside of horror fandom as a rejection of cinema as an art form. Critics and cinephiles in general tend to dismiss genre cinema wholesale, and genre fans as well, and seeing members of the community react to these films with such violent negativity only reinforces their image of the horror fan as a slack-jawed dullard whose only interests are sex and gore. Not my only interests. For anyone who considers themselves to be both a cinephile and a genre fan, seeing other self-proclaimed fans behave this way is both disheartening and infuriating. I know because I consider myself both of these things, and I know a good number of intelligent people, thoughtful people, who do as well. And like most of these people, I was excited by and greatly admired The Babadook, It Follows, and The Witch. All 3 films are considerably more artful and deal with much more complex concepts and issues than typical mainstream horror fare. Like anyone else, I have my own opinions about them. I don't begrudge anyone who doesn't agree that these films are some of the best genre cinema in recent memory. The problem lies with horror fans whose definition of the genre is so narrow that it somehow does not include stories in which an unstoppable supernatural monster terrorizes a grieving mother and her troubled child, The Babadook, an inexplicable supernatural monster is passed along as a curse between people, It Follows, or an isolated family is set upon by a supernatural evil that lives in a foreboding wilderness, The Witch. This is especially dumbfounding in the latter case, which is sort of an adaptation of the first horror stories that arose in the early settings of America by the British and eventually led to the Salem witch trials. It's not just a horror story. It is almost literally a prototypical horror story. Like Lars von Trier's Antichrist, The Witch takes the genre back to primal, lizard brain territory. Fear of the dark, fear of nature, fear of the unknown, and most of all, fear of other people. Even the ones you think you know. How anyone could come away from The Witch and deny that it is a horror film defies reasonable explanation. Interestingly, this is a point which cinephiles who do not necessarily consider themselves genre fans and those horror gatekeepers have in common. The Witch is an intricately detailed portrait of life on the American frontier in the early 17th century. Eggers spent years exhaustively researching the period, as he did for The Lighthouse, which is why I think it was so good. And his obsessive attention to detail pays off enormously. Like other recent acclaimed period pieces, such as Alexei German's Hard to Be a God, and Eisenhow's The Assassin, The Witch feels less like a replica of a time period and more like someone managed to use a time machine and send a film crew back in that time. The family's isolated farm and dense forest feel like a complete universe, absolutely. The precise framing and cinematography by Jaron Blaschke calls to mind Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, and not just because much of it was shot using natural light. The Witch is unquestionably the work of a serious artist, to the point that critics who usually are not interested in genre cinema may find themselves praising its technical excellence while asserting that any film made with such care and intelligence by definition cannot be a horror film. In other words, both the horror gatekeepers and the cinephiles who dismiss genre cinema have narrow definitions of what constitutes a horror film, and both seem to believe that any film made at a certain level of quality must be automatically disqualified from being defined as such. I will admit that I subscribe to a broad definition of a horror genre. So do I. But no part of it is determined by a film's production value or budget. Absolutely not. It makes sense for horror fans to be impressed by ingenious filmmakers who use minimal resources to maximum effect. It does not make sense for the same fans to shun expensive, handsomely mounted genre films on principle. Guillermo del Toro's, by the way, you can plug in The Witch. Where the Witch is plugged in, you can plug in the Lighthouse to all of that, and I completely agree 100%. And then it goes on, it talks about Crimson Peak. The biggest problems with expectations when evaluating any film is that the viewer's expectations going into the film are not the film's responsibility. The complaint that the best parts of the movie are in the trailer is not a complaint about the movie in question, it's a complaint about the trailer spoiling the movie. Likewise, the complaint that the trailer made it look like a totally different movie is a complaint about the film's marketing, not the film itself. These can be and frequently are valid complaints, but they should have no bearing on the viewer's impression of a film. When most of the films that are now considered sacred texts, like The Exorcist and Night of the Living Dead, were originally released, they made such an indelible pop culture imprint because they were largely unprecedented in their form and content as well as their success. These films have been hugely influential. I would throw in there the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as well. And expecting any new horror film to instantly have the same kind of impact on viewers and the culture at large is expecting the impossible. We've had decades to consider the power and influence of Halloween. As of this writing, most viewers have had hours to put The Witch into its context in genre film history. And this goes on, and I'll read the final paragraph. We will never be able to shout down the gatekeepers, but if the genre is to keep moving forward, it is important to seek out and support those films made not just for the horror fan, but for the people who love the cinematic art and who happen to love horror movies as well. And it's equally important to seek out fellow horror cinephiles. Just because we love horror in our own way doesn't mean everyone else does. Means everyone else is wrong. It's important for anyone who's been kicked out of the clubhouse to stick together and to make our communities more welcoming and inclusive. After all, more horror fans in the world is a better thing for all of us, because you never know where the next filmmaker who may one day make the next Repulsion or Saw might come from. And there you go. I love that article. I'm going to put it into the live chat so you can read it. I thought it was a great article and a great overview of horror, and I felt the same way. I was like, this is exactly what went on when I saw, or after I saw The Witch, and I was raving about it, and a lot of people were like, oh, it's boring. But I think horror is kind of like the cave that Luke went into in The Empire Strikes Back on Dagobah. You only have what you take with you into these experiences, and I think the Witch requires a high level of cognitive reasoning to find it scary. I mean, I think just like in Rosemary's Baby, the paranoia that film generates, it's masterful in what it does, and I think it's really, really important. And I think it's incredibly well done. Look, I love the Hell's a Poppin' zombie violence in Romero's Day of the Dead. I think it's fantastic. But that movie, after all, is also about this push-pull between science and the military. And there's a lot that's interesting that's going on, even in Romero's later Living Dead films, like Land of the Dead or Diary of the Dead or Survival of the Dead, which I would say are lesser films to the original trilogy of Night, Dawn, and Day. They're still really interesting. And, it really is what you take with you. And I think horror as a genre is very, very healthy. I really like a lot of what's going on. There's why am I blanking on the name? There's a Netflix film about these guys that are hunting and they go into the woods. I really love that. It's a British film. I think they're in the Scottish Highlands or something, and one of their friends has died, and they're taking this hike because he could never make it because he was like killed in a stick up. Is it the Excursion or something like that? But there's a lot of really, really interesting horror films that run the gamut for anybody who's a fan. And I think back to reading this book, and if you haven't, by the way, I mean, I know it came out in 1981, so it came out 39 years ago. But if you haven't read Danse Macabre, I would highly recommend this because it is Stephen King. And, you look into his past. You think, I mean, Stephen King wasn't the Stephen King we know today, even though we'd seen at the time Carrie had come out, and I think the Salem's Lot miniseries had come out, and The Shining had come out the year before this book was released. But this book was such a favorite of mine, and it's certainly one of my most prized, I think, possessions, only because it was so enjoyable to read, and his discussions of the genre were very, very illuminating. And it's a Stephen King book from 39 years ago. And, so good stuff there. And I think that, some more chats came in, and I've got letters to read, ladies and gentlemen. I have letters to read. Let's see. Stub McShave sends in a tip and says the xenomorph in Alien has elements of all three of Stephen King's types of horror. By explaining its origins, they diminish the terror element of the xenomorph. Also, Lovecraftian horror is mostly of the terror criteria. I totally agree. Like, some of Lovecraft's work's a little difficult to get through, but I got to tell you, I didn't see it. It was playing in theaters here. I didn't even know it. Richard Stanley is back. Richard Stanley of Hardware fame, and who directed a movie called Dust Devil that I have a beautiful 3-disc DVD set for. He has a new adaptation of Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space that has actually been adapted before to film, I think more than once. But I can't wait to see that. I mean, we're getting a Lovecraft adaptation. The DVD, the hard copy, comes out this month, and I didn't realize that it was playing in local theaters. It was actually at the ArcLight, and I was bummed I didn't go. But I think that you're absolutely right, Stubble. I think one of the great missteps in modern cinema is Prometheus. This idea that Ridley Scott wanted to go back and demystify the xenomorph, because one of the great things, look, I'm of the belief that Alien is pretty much a perfect movie for what it is. Absolutely flawless. Now, if you want to go back and you want to criticize the computer screens or something like that, because that's the way they looked when it was made, but I think that the look at the future, but mostly the creation of the xenomorph and those poor souls, those poor blue-collar workers that, were just kind of like, okay, we got to go to keep our shares. We have to answer this distress signal, and what happens afterwards. I completely agree with you. I think the xenomorph in Alien is one of the greatest horror creations, if not the greatest monster ever committed to film. But that was what was so great about Alien, was like the best of horror, like the best cosmic horror, like the best Lovecraftian horror, who was the space jockey? Why was he piloting a ship full of thousands of eggs, each with a facehugger in it? Why was he doing that? And it was something we would never know. That was the best part. We would never know. There are cosmic questions posed by the infinite void that we are never going to be able to answer. And that's where the existential dread comes from. But no, they had to go ruin it. Alien Hatch Sound says, the first portion of Marathon Man has amazing horror moments. Oh my God, yes it does. If you guys haven't seen Marathon Man, is it safe? With Dustin Hoffman and Laurence Olivier, you got to watch Marathon Man. Woo! Now, it's not a horror movie per se. I'd call it a political thriller, maybe. But man, is it intense. Yes, sir. Another story set in a lighthouse, A Drop of Water from Black Sabbath. That grimacing witch, still itches my id. A Drop of Water from Black Sabbath. The Mario Bava movie. Mario Bava, like, one of my favorite horror movies is Black Sunday, or as it was known in Europe, Mask of the Demon. What a wonderful movie. And if you watch that film, it has fairy tale elements, but it's it's shot entirely on a movie set. It's incredible. Anonymous says, Braxton discovered Hitchcock Saw the Birds Anonymous tip $1. Braxton discovered Hitchcock, saw The Birds, Rear Window, and Trouble with Harry, and loved them. Would this be coming from our friend up there in Portland? Isn't Braxton a young man? Isn't he a little young? But hey, if he discovered Hitchcock and saw The Birds, Rear Window, and Trouble with Harry, and loved them, then Braxton is a man after my own heart. And that is fantastic. So I got letters, ladies and gentlemen. I got letters to read. Letters to read for you. Yes, that was, I believe that was Calvin Bowles talking about his son Braxton, who we, in fact, love, which is fantastic. This letter comes from Renee Peraza. Dear Robert, firstly, I'm a huge fan of your work. I'm writing as I listen to your live chat. We must be in the same age group, 1966, I'm a year later, because we share parity on many, many subjects in entertainment. I'm a self-represented SAG-AFTRA professional, recent high-profile work with Hugh Laurie on Chance, cool, Hulu and Fox as Detective Ollie Ribeiro, directed by Andrew Bernstein from Netflix Ozark. I love Ozark. I've done long-running work for Franklin Templeton, Seagate, Intel, Cisco, and many more, including bilingual work, Spanish and English. Both languages are impeccable, can also do accents. Should you need on-screen talent, off-screen voiceover for any production you may be working on, I offer myself as a resource. I just finished a sold-out original run of Below Sycamore as Father Ruiz at the beloved Shelton Theater in San Francisco. Renee. Well, thank you, Renee. I appreciate that. I will definitely keep you in mind. I love hearing from people that are working and hearing what they, in fact, are working on. Because, man, I do love that. This one comes from John D. Rob, we love your show. Love the new Robservatory, but show us the wall of hot toys already. Wondering something. Why does Campia have his head shaved so far up Shazam's ass that he can't see the light of day? He insists on saying it was a fan-frickin-tastic movie, a definite win for WB. Why? We thought it was okay, but such a definitive win? How? And he always says Aquaman was okay. It made a lot of money, but okay. It was fantastic, and I think you loved it too. I think the only reason he needs to emphasize Shazam was a definite win is to keep up his mantra that WB is on a roll with 4 definitive wins. Help me understand, Rob. Well, John D., I think John Campia, he just likes Shazam. Like, I was not a fan of Shazam. I certainly wanted to be a fan of Shazam, but I found it disappointing. Which kind of bums me out. But what can I do? Yeah. I don't know. I think he just likes it. And yeah, that's but look, the wall of hot toys, I promised when I hit 20,000 subscribers I would show the wall of hot toys. I didn't realize I was going to get so many subscribers after the whole Duel of the Fates script analysis. And I'm sorry my Dune script analysis has been taken down. I'm going to put it back up on the website, so it can't be taken down, so you can see that again. Warner Brothers, they struck the channel, ladies and gentlemen. They were not happy. And it was funny because you see what they objected to, and they objected to me just my opinion, which, you know, my opinion of something is not a copyright violation. But anyway, this next letter comes from John Suntress, our friend John from the Word Balloon podcast that I really love. If you like comic creators and you like comic books and pop culture, John Suntress's The Word Balloon podcast out of Chicago is a fantastic podcast. He has written me a letter. And he says, "Hey, Rob, some thoughts after 3 episodes of Picard. Hoo boy. After rewatching the episodes numerous times, I've got a better grip on what the status of the Romulan Empire is. The current governing body is the Romulan Free State. The only mention of the Romulan Free State is when it was briefly muttered by the Trill Dr. Soji helps with her uniform in Episode 2. Compare that to the full 6-minute scene we get in Star Trek VI about the state of the Klingon Empire after the Praxis explosion. That's literally in the first 10 minutes of the whole movie. We are 3 episodes over 2 hours of Picard's show, and we as viewers still don't have a clear explanation of who's governing the Romulans as far as the Federation knows. Of course, there's some secrets to have a story mystery, but surely the Federation knows who's on the surface running Romulans the way the U.S. knows Putin's government is in charge of Russia. Shouldn't the audience know these basics by now too? Bad writing. Here's 2 theories as to where the show might be going. First, Bruce Maddox is a secret Romulan whose evil plans will be retconned to go back to the Measure of a Man episode. And second, Maddox also built Agnes and will discover whatever happened to her twin later too. I feel like John Nash in A Beautiful Mind at this point. You're supposed to call an ambulance for me because I'm going over these episodes trying to make sense of it all like a madman with the Zapruder film. Well, John, I feel your pain. It's so weird because I just think the writing is so hackneyed. Maybe, everyone keeps saying, well, maybe it'll get better. Maybe it will get better. But who knows? I don't know if it will get better. I hope. This one comes from Bob Viernig. Bob Viernig says, I watched Hatred of AI and All Synthetic Life is Illogical, Robservations episode 329. I enjoyed the episode, but I think you're being a bit overcritical. Maybe it's me trying to be positive. Picard's first 2 episodes certainly have their problems. When I compare it to any Star Trek content in the last 15 years, I think it's better than anything. The problems with Star Trek predate 2009. The last Next Gen films were awful. The whole first season of Next Gen was not very good. The original Star Trek had plenty of bad episodes. What? We're only 2 episodes into the story, and there's plenty of time to become positive. The show doesn't end each episode with a simple, clean resolution. That doesn't mean the series isn't going to end with growth. Why rush on the hate wagon? Well, Bob, that's a very good point. But I'll tell you why. Because they've had 54 years of Star Trek. They've had good Star Trek. They've had great Star Trek, excellent Star Trek, and not so good Star Trek. They should know by now what works and what doesn't work. So they should come out of the gate. There's this weird thing. Well, these other series weren't good out of the gate. I would say that the original series is pretty damn good out of the gate. But there's no reason. I mean, this show should have been the greatest Star Trek of all, really. The problem really comes with the writing and the fact that you don't have a visionary at the front calling all the shots. It's a mishmash of ideas that I don't think gel together very well. And I want to love Picard. I want to love Picard. As many people know, I, of course, did in fact produce documentaries on the making of Next Generation that were on the Blu-rays. I worked on it for 3 years. I sat down with Patrick Stewart at length on numerous occasions. I even hosted an on-camera discussion that's on the Season 2 Blu-ray. There's me and the entire cast of Next Gen. Basically, I just prodded them with questions and stood back while they talked, because who wanted to hear me talk? I mean, you've got Robservations now for that, right? But I'm so disappointed because it should be better than it is, and I wish it was better. I really do. But yeah, look, I want it to get better, but it looks like, again, we're meeting we're going to meet a group of female Romulan monks or a religious order, the Romulan Bene Gesserit. I mean, they are so transparent in their borrowing, judiciously borrowing from other people. It's frustrating. I hope it gets better. Look, man, as everyone knows, I tune in. I watch, damn it. I absolutely watch, and I just hope that it gets better than it is. I really do. I want it to be better. This one comes from Daniel Barger. Hello, Robert. I'm a huge fan, both figuratively and literally, of your work, opinion, and personality. Why, thank you. I go by the name Nola Nerd on YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter to give you a reference to whom you're conversing. I miss John Schnepp just as much as you do, I would assume. And you get sweaty. I always rewatch and listen to the old Collider Heroes episodes when working or working out. The most recent episode I'm on is why I had to send this communication to you. It is episode 144 of Heroes. Wow, you're going back a few years. Titled, Could the Justice League Lead into Flashpoint? You, John, and Amy were taking Twitter questions, and at minute 444, actually 444, 4 minutes and 44 seconds, is actually the name of an Abel Ferrara movie. I don't know why I'm saying that, but at minute 444, a viewer question from a Mike Olson was read asking if Black Widow was a Skrull because of her Budapest line in the Avengers, possibly hinting to not having the same memory as Hawkeye. That question led to a discussion between you and Schnepp, mostly about Black Widow and her character, which naturally led to conversations about Black Widow having a standalone film. At this time, Black Widow was not announced to be even in pre-production or anything whatsoever, but listening to John Schnepp talk about his wants and desires for that standalone movie if it were to happen, with your opinions, totally brought me to tears, because it is almost here. And I know John Schnepp would be sweating hard, sweating bullets all over that heroes and that he knew, sweating bullets all over that hero's desk and set if he knew they were introducing the Taskmaster. Taskmaster, Avengers 190 in the comics, was the first comic I ever bought and read, so I am beyond tickled 16 different shades of orange and blue for this movie. If you haven't in a while, go back and watch that episode and listen to the conversation again, then compare to where we are at now. I wish John was here to see all this, so you're my link to him because you were a mainstay on that show, which was not the same after he passed. Have a wonderful day, Robert. I hope you get to read this. Sincerely, Daniel Barger, the NOLA nerd. Well, Daniel, wow, you've succeeded in choking me up. I'll have to go back and watch that. I really felt that when I was watching Endgame. I was sitting there. I saw Infinity War sitting right next to John Schnepp and Amy Dallin, and I think Coy was next to us too. And I just, when I saw Endgame, I keenly felt his absence because he dearly would have loved these things. And man, like that one shot with the Taskmaster getting that shield of his own shield, John would have loved that. He would love where we are. You know what he would have loved too? He would have loved Aquaman. He would have loved Aquaman. John would have just been like, he would have loved it. But I want to thank you for that. I will go check out that episode of Heroes. I never go back and watch those things, but maybe with the amount of time that's passed, I should go back and do just that. Our man Emil Johansson is here. And here's what Emil Johansson has to say. Star Wars is trash. Star Wars is groundbreaking when it came out, and there are like 0 people who dislike the original movies. That's why Star Wars is trash now, because I can't seriously compare the new era of Star Wars and say it's still good when it has that legacy. It's supposed to be the biggest franchise in the world, but it has been reduced to something annoying. The only reason people say Star Wars is good is because of the legacy. The only reason people like Force Awakens is because it reminds them of Star Wars and the old movies. But you can't hook people on a nostalgia drug forever. And I think eventually people will realize the new movies have undermined the entire phenomenon. The movies are made by people who didn't even attempt to respect the source material. Instead, there were 3 scripts of fan fiction that had no continuity because they were made by 3 different people. Well, and instead of the 3rd version, we got Rise of Skywalker, which just tried to tie it all together. The Mandalorian was good, but not really that good. It was average. The Clone Wars is fun for kids, but not really that special. A main character that is never mentioned in the movies and changes in canon on the betrayal of the clones. Nothing in the new era of movies have made any sense, and nothing about it fits into Star Wars. The name is the only thing carrying it, but it's a giant lie that will probably disappear with time. I'm so sick of trying to invest myself into this franchise with its lore, the games, the comics, the books, and see a big finale on the big screen that really was nothing special at all. Episode 7 created mysteries that will never have satisfying answers. What happened after Episode 6? How did the First Order come to be? And what exactly are they? Some allegory for neo-Nazis? They don't fit in, and the new movies have not made me happy at all, and it's time I admit that. They ruin for everyone that tries to invest themselves into the original movies, the prequels, or the many canonical, or even not, books, TV shows, and whatever. They shit in your face, but you have to accept it because it's the only Star Wars that exists. I hate it. Well, Emil, what I really appreciate about this letter is how sort of you beat around the bush. You don't go directly at what you think. No, I know that's a quick, easy joke to make, but look, I don't disagree with you. I feel the same way about Star Trek. I mean, it's such a strange thing. There's this rich world of all this material out there, and it's like J.J. Abrams, and I blame him. I mean, he's done this to both franchises. He's tried to turn it into something that it's not, and I just think worse, it shows how uniquely untalented he is, both as a film director and as a writer. And yet, he keeps getting these franchises, and he got a $500 million deal with Warner Brothers. I'm sure he's going to take over superhero movies, and it's just, I don't know. I don't disagree with you, which is sort of unfortunate that I don't. Brian Eng is here. Uh-oh. Whenever Brian Eng writes in, I know there's going to be some kind of a here it comes. Oh, this is different. Brian Eng says, speaking of the impossible premise, I talked about the impossible premise in regards to Manifest, which I have not seen this week's episode, but boy, am I excited. Speaking of the impossible premise, did you watch J.J. Abrams' NBC show Revolution, which takes place in an apocalyptic world where all electricity has been gone for 15 years? It was canceled after 2 seasons and resolved in a comic book. Of course it was. Again, I hated that show. I'm like, why is there no electricity? Like, give me a break. I mean, I get it, but they again, impossible premise. I watched this, I'm like, that's stupid. You know, that's the kind of premise that a normal person would be like, okay, I get where you're going with that, but no electricity? Like, how can that possibly be? There's electricity in nature. How do you get rid of it all? I mean, I know. And of course it was resolved in a comic book. Yeah, again, there you go. Not a big fan. Let's see. This is an interesting letter. It's a little long. Comes from Philip Jaffrey. One critical flaw with the sequel trilogy of Star Wars is that it does little to build on how things were after Return of the Jedi. Amen, sir. I know the notion of how the New Republic functions as a political entity are described in supplementary novels and comics, but it would have been nice to see how it worked in the film series. A story of how people of disparate political and ideological backgrounds embark on this grand project would have been great to see. As a child, I used to be interested in all kinds of things, from politics, history, meteorology, to astronomy or anatomy. I somehow doubt today's children, or many adults, would be interested in high political drama in a Star Wars setting. In fact, it would have given more gravity to the events of the destruction of their new capital, Hosnian Prime, and the loss of their political establishment. Without this, all we have is essentially a reset to the previous status quo. In many ways, The Force Awakens felt more like a proof of concept rather than a cohesive story to me. You and me too, brother. But then surely the New Republic should have had contingencies anyway? I don't just mean in the event of an attack, but say if there was an event like the Permian-Triassic extinction event, or if there was a meteor collision, a gamma-ray burst, or some other stellar phenomenon that made the planet uninhabitable. Also, the whole disarmament thing is kind of a poor decision strategically. When you look at any time in history, if anything, there would be increased security in place just after a military revolution in order to prevent retaliation from sympathizers of the previous administration and attacks from other factions both internal and abroad. There would be greater, which, by the way, they go into in depth in Denis Villeneuve's Dune script. There would be greater emphasis on intelligence to ensure that a figure like Palpatine never comes to power again, and likely a removal of the aristocratic classes and establishment figures from positions of influence, if not an outright purge. For a suitable frame of reference, just look into the below PDF about the origins of the French Revolutionary Army, the politics that led to it, and the subsequent changes since its inception. Another relates to the establishment. Oh, these are all good letters, or all good articles. Another relates to the establishment of the Red Army and what it meant for both the Communist Party and the military, militarizing the former in terms of attitudes and rhetoric and politicizing the latter. On the topic of revolution, and this is my own personal idea, it would have been interesting to have Leia and her group be similar to the sailors during the Kronstadt Rebellion, becoming gradually disillusioned with the thing they helped create, petitioning for economic and political reforms before their final doomed rebellion, with the New Republic being allegorical to the Bolshevik government. Or a story from the perspective of a New Republic equivalent of a commissar, a political military officer, a space communist flashman. Now, that would be cool. Here, I'm going to dump this into the live chat. It links to the Let's see. Oh, wait. Does it? Maybe not. Well, this is, in fact, on the website. So look up Philip Jaffrey's article. You can find it there. What a great article that is. Thank you for that, Philip. A great perspective, by the way. This comes from our old moderator, Terry Flynn. Terry Flynn sends in a letter. Dear Rob, new job stuff means I don't get to tune in often, but I hope all is well. I'll get straight to the point. My views on new Star Trek align extremely closely with yours. However, I'd like to play devil's advocate on one point that might be a chink in our armor, and which, truth be told, concerns me about one potentially major criticism you and I have of new Star Trek. It concerns the utopian, or increasingly dystopian, vision of Trek itself. Here is a question that perhaps illustrates my concerns about my and perhaps your worries about new Trek. Whilst there are lots of reasons to legitimately criticize all the new Trek shows, can we, in all honesty, criticize Picard for its Federation dystopia view of the world, given what was lauded in classic Star Trek? So here's where I play devil's advocate. In The Next Generation, the Federation wanted to use a computer virus to commit genocide against the Borg. In Deep Space Nine, although it was Section 31 that developed the virus to wipe out the Founders, the Federation, having learnt of this, essentially said, yeah, dude, not great, but hey, ends justify the means, and we're okay with this. I'm thinking that some 23rd, 24th century version of the current 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council must sign off on all such Federation decisions. We'd already gone down the rabbit hole of the Vulcans not being quite so pacifist in Enterprise, and the DS9 behavior seems more logical as a result, since I'm sure Vulcan is a permanent Security Council member or equivalent. I love DS9 more and more as time goes on. Truth be told, although Tolkien hated allegories, it is an allegorical nature that in part attracts me to DS9. Furthermore, let's remember our own history. All empires, federations, and confederations in our history have fallen eventually. Is some gradual deterioration of the Federation due to perceived huge external threats and the ability of people in power to set the agenda really such a stupid idea in 3 centuries' time? We know from genetic studies that we are all too influenced by genes that took thousands of years to develop and which were appropriate when fight or flight were the only options. Much as I respect Roddenberry, I have to question whether 3 centuries is sufficient for us to dampen or eliminate the effects of such genes. TNG and especially DS9 showed us what humans do when cornered, as Quark so memorably told Nog. While I definitely agree that Picard is heavy-handed and so ridiculously allegorical regarding the Orange Man and Brexit that it is laughable, you yourself have discussed a possible Star Trek iteration set far in the future when the Federation either is no more or in trouble. So my ultimate question is, although Picard is badly written, full of canon violations and other problems, might its broad premise not be so stupid as we are tempted to say? After all, Roddenberry didn't know what we know about genes. How long can it take to breed bad stuff out, etc.? Maybe Roddenberry's vision is appropriate 1,000 years in the future, but not 300 or 400? Plus, it's interesting that the Orville is set further in the future than Star Trek, but has a lot more recognizable human traits and vulnerabilities, and many laud it as better Star Trek. Cheers, Terry. Terry, great letter. Another great letter from you, sir. Again, I don't disagree with you, but I think, my problem with a lot of all of this is that it's just not very good. Like, I don't mind the idea that we're going to sort of slip into a dystopia. For my own Star Trek treatment, my own idea is that the Federation was just old and it wasn't maintained. And when things shift and stuff happens, I just don't believe the shift that they're giving us. Like you said, it's so heavy-handed. It's so Brexit. It's so Trump America. It's so, that it becomes a little bit. I would rather the story have focused more on Picard, that he was more of a proactive character, that he later in life he was suffering from a certain ennui, and that he took matters into his own hands. He didn't have to be presented a mission by a strange girl that came at him for an inexplicable reason. But I don't disagree with you. But yeah. This comes from Paul Dickinson. He says, I'd love to know your thoughts on this look at Rick Berman. Is it a hatchet job or is there a foundation to this. Well, I watched this. Yeah, there's this Renegade cut video. You know what? I'll put this into the I think it was a little harsh, to be honest. I really do. I think it was a little harsh. It's a piece on Rick Berman. Look, Rick Berman, yeah, did he rule with an iron fist? Yes. Did he frequently bump heads with the creatives? Yes, he did. But let's face it, the guy was responsible for 25 seasons of Star Trek over 18 years. So he has to have done something right. So I think it's a bit of a hatchet job. Here's something interesting. Brian Eng writes in another one. On Tuesday, you showed us an old film of a train. This was last Tuesday, of a train arriving at a station that was improved with modern technology. You also gave it a minor criticism for looking like video. Please elaborate on why looking like video is a bad thing. Well, no, I don't think looking like video is a bad thing. I just don't like the look of video from an aesthetic point of view. I mean, one of the great things that I loved in my lifetime was the advent of progressive scan video as opposed to interlaced video. Now, what does that mean? When we grew up until the HD era, up until the 2000s, when we grew up with broadcast television, from its inception up until the advent of HD, we basically watched what is called interlaced video, which means we watched video running at 30 frames a second, but it's actually what are called video fields. There's two video fields in every two video fields that made up every frame. And what they would do is go like this, 60 times a second. And when progressive scan video came about, and we first saw this with DVD technology, each frame was locked like this and there was no interlacing. So you could get a much more filmic look, and there was just a much more texturized quality. We all know when we call it looking like video or soap opera or whatever, all of that is a factor of how video brought, how our perception of video is. And it's a lot like the real world, but it has to do more with lighting and how much was there. And the movement isn't as naturalistic. And look, I thought it was amazing. And also it has to do with the frame rates. When they were shooting video back in the day, they weren't shooting 24 frames. They were shooting 18 frames. The frame rates sometimes were all over the place. So it's not a bad thing. That was an amazing example of archival, an old movie brought to life with machine learning and detail. I think it was great, as far as it goes. I mean, amazing what Peter Jackson did with his World War I documentary. It's amazing. I was just quipping that from a aesthetic point of view, not my favorite thing in the world. But it's amazing that we have that record of that time. I mean, it's really, really amazing. My man James Wallace sent in a letter. James Wallace, who I actually met at the Pasadena Art Walk, he's on a job. I think he's on a job. I think he's somewhere in the middle of the country working on a film. Hi, Rob. The third episode of Star Trek Picard made things worse. In the tradition of this series, it seems the teasers are flashbacks to explain why things are the way they are. However, the teaser in the third episode screams of being an additional shoot. The writing of this scene is very poor, and it's hard to understand why Raffi hates Picard or has issues with him. It's not his fault. He did what he could, but she blames him for her eventual dismissal from Starfleet. Why is she getting fired? It doesn't make sense. Plus, all the strange character beats Michelle Hurd goes through makes her acting look pretty bad. It's not her fault. It's the writing. In the latter scenes with Picard, again, it's hard to understand why Raffi hates Picard so much. It's so forced of conflict that isn't needed and inorganic to the narrative. Same with the poor writing of Rios, just tepid. Why is he keeping his injury? Again, it doesn't make sense. The acting by Santiago Cabrera is abysmal at times when he's acting as his hologram doppelgangers. Why did the director allow him to act the way he did? Are the producers just trying to make the supporting actors look bad to make Patrick Stewart look good? I like Patrick Stewart in some aspects of the show. However, there are a lot of problems with this show already that make me believe the Midnight's Edge sources. Right now, I'm on the verge of hate watching. I've already paid for the month. Here's hoping Jonathan Frakes directs better episodes in 4 and 5, or that season 2 is better. Well, can't disagree, man. I'm not a big fan of what they've done with the show, and it could have been so much smarter, so much cooler than it is, which bums me out. Alex M. sent in a super chat and says, random shout out to Ira Stephen Bear. Stay ballsy. Well, Alex M., I will stay ballsy, and I want to thank you for supporting the channel in that way. I very much appreciate it. I love Ira Bear, the mastermind behind Deep Space Nine. He was sort of left to his own devices, and the show was all the better for it. Stubble McShave has written in quite an extensive letter, but Stubble is always a great supporter of the channel and always has good things to say, so I'm going to read it. Greetings to the evangelist of entertainment enthusiasm. I wanted to talk a little bit about science fiction. This will be just a stream of thought without much connecting them, but that should be familiar to you since you also go out on some tangents at times. Do I? Science fiction has always been the genre that asks, what if? It looked at what we were as a civilization today and extrapolated to a possible vision of the future. Some of these future visions were dystopian, as in 1984, whereas some were more excited for a more positive future that could be seen in early Star Trek. I don't think the general public realizes how many of our cultural cornerstones are science fiction concepts. Both the visions of Jules Verne featuring technological wonders in adventure stories, as well as Mary Shelley extrapolating on the science of life and electricity in Frankenstein, are not considered science fiction by some, just because they were written more than a century ago. They have become ingrained in our collective cultural consciousness and are just seen as legendary stories. Much of our technological development has been formed through the visions of science fiction. The iPad is clearly inspired by the pad in Star Trek, the personal access display device. One can only wonder what technology that's featured in today's science fiction media that will become reality in 10 or 15 years. As I said earlier, science fiction is the genre of what if. It's also often a very allegorical genre. It, just as fantasy, makes it possible to examine a touchy subject through an allegorical lens. One of my favorite episodes of Star Trek is the DS9 episode Duet. That is the penultimate episode of Season 1. It examines the issue of concentration camps through the eyes of someone distant from our own human history. It can delve into these issues in a way that we couldn't do about the Holocaust and concentration camps here on Earth because our own emotional baggage gets in the way. If any Post-Geek Singularity members haven't seen the episode, you should. It's one of the best hours of television ever produced, and on a much smaller budget than today's Star Trek. I couldn't agree with you more. Duet is peak Star Trek, and it shows how a Star Trek episode, even if it's set in basically one room, can be incredible. I prefer much of the classic science fiction from the modern contemporary science fiction. There are, however, some modern science fiction books that I think are great. I started reading the Expanse series before it was made into a TV series, and I always liked it. It's a science fiction series that deals with many big things at once. It has hard military sci-fi elements as well as political intrigue and mystery solving. If we get more book series like that, it bodes well for the future of the genre. I will finish with a few words about Dune. One thing that I always appreciated about Dune was how Frank Herbert interconnected spice to magic, as well as to the economy and to space travel. The interconnectedness of spice in all forms of the society makes it into a strong plot device that Frank uses to great effect. Dune was one of the best space opera book series that I've ever read, at least the first few books. I didn't care as much for some of the later ones. It's also one of my favorite books that has a third omniscient point of view, and we see a given scene from everyone's viewpoint. Dune and The Hobbit are two of the most famous third-person omniscient books. I hope the upcoming Dune movies will do the books justice. I think at least the first one does. I will end this with a quote from Brandon Sanderson. The purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. Thanks, Stubble. Well, I love that quote. I love that quote, Stubble, and I agree with, surprisingly, everything you've written. We park our shuttlecrafts in the same shuttle bay, and what a great What a great letter. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the last letter I'm going to read today, guess who wrote it? That's right, Miss Willow Yang. She of Willow Talk, our favorite PhD molecular biologist, published author, published in a respected journal. The great Willow Yang. Greetings, Rob. I really enjoyed the letter that Manuel sent a while back, prior to your brief hiatus, regarding the male gaze and the depiction of male and female characters on screen. I certainly don't pretend to understand much about psychology, nor have I read any film analyses like the studies that Manuel has cited, so everything that I'm going to say is based on my own personal feelings. Here's the thing. When it comes to representation, I don't actually want to see myself being represented on screen, in the sense that I'm not clamoring for some short, chubby, socially anxious introvert to be the protagonist of the next big action movie. When it comes to fantasy, I want to see heightened characters that are physically and intellectually idealized, characters that don't necessarily reflect who I am, but who I daydream to be. And personally, I've never really had an issue with projecting myself onto a character or into a character who's of a different gender or ethnicity. I love imagining myself as the T-800 or Aragorn or Judge Dredd or John Wick. It isn't so much about the inclusion of women in stories that has bothered me. It's more about their depiction and roles. Manuel's letter really hit the nail on the head for me when they discussed about how male characters cater to a presumably male audience's wish fulfillment fantasies. Female characters, I find, have often just not been, for lack of a better word, cool. They are not designed to cater to my wish fulfillment fantasies. Quite often they are delegated to supporting roles. They are there to comfort and nurture the male protagonist, to serve as a prize to be won, to be taken hostage, or to be used as bargaining chips, to sometimes be killed in order to advance the hero's character development. I don't want to be Madeline in The Departed, or Mary Jane in Raimi's Spider-Man, or Karen in Goodfellas, or Lucilla in Gladiator, or Adrian in Rocky, or Rachel in Nolan's Batman. I want to be Frank Costello. That's the best thing I'm going to read all week. I want to be Spider-Man. I want to be Tommy DeVito. I want to be Maximus Decimus Meridius. I want to be Rocky Balboa. I want to be Batman, and while I do think that a character like Princess Leia is a great heroine, I do wonder, do people want to be her? Given the choice, would you take her role? Or would you prefer to be Luke, or Han, or Obi-Wan, or Vader, or Palpatine? I know that I would love to wield a lightsaber. I want to wield a lightsaber too. Of course, I understand that there is reality, that there are biological differences between men and women. Hang on, please. That historically, women typically had less prominent roles compared to men. It isn't easy for war movies or gangster films set in the real world to feature women in action roles without having to sacrifice historical accuracy. Genre entertainment, like science fiction and fantasy, certainly has much more leeway in that matter. I love watching the wuxia films and television series when I was in high school. Although the shows were typically male-led, they do often feature a number of female warriors doing some badass stunts that I love to fantasize about. I get thrills, a rush of adrenaline when I see a character like Michelle Yee's Haitang fighting her way through multiple opponents in The Royal Swordsman, or Hua Wook's female Shifu taking out a dozen fools with a single blow in The Proud Twins. Oh, I love how you snuck some things that I have to go find now. The feeling is so strong and intoxicating that I sometimes can't sit still. I pace about the room and skip and reenact the scenes in my head, overcome with excitement and ecstasy. Just how great was that fight between Michelle Yeoh and Zhang Zi in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon? Got my blood pumping in all the right places, if you know what I'm saying. I defy anyone, regardless of their gender, to watch that duel and not wish they could fight like these two women. And since we've been talking about nudity and eroticism the past few weeks, I've got to say, the pickings can be a little slim when you're a straight woman. I remember when I was taking an 8th grade drama class and somehow our drama teacher began talking about the Baywatch television series. I haven't watched the show myself, but according to my teacher, it's got an opening scene showing beautiful bikini-clad women running across the beach with their breasts bouncing in slow motion. That's considered socially acceptable, I remember her saying. But for some reason, you don't ever see buff men in Speedos running with a close-up shot on their package swaying around. How often do you see a man rearing his ass the way Megan Fox does in Michael Bay's Transformers? How often do you see a threesome that involves two hot men making out with each other like Scarlett Johansson and Penelope Cruz in Vicky Cristina Barcelona? I'd say not enough. Yennefer seems to be naked in every other scene in The Witcher, but I have to wait several episodes just to catch a glimpse of Henry Cavill's bare chest. Now, I'm absolutely not saying that the sexualization of women is problematic and needs to stop. Quite the contrary. I'm advocating for equality. The male form is just as much a work of art as the female form and deserves to be celebrated, damn it! Of course, I don't expect all films to be made for me, and I don't need a character to be of the same gender or ethnicity as I am to be able to connect with them. However, I can't deny my pleasure in seeing women being given more entertaining, more interesting, more cool roles on screen, roles that I'd actually want to emulate in my imagination. I'm glad that we have characters like Ellen Ripley, Sarah Connor, Buffy Summers, River Tam, Katniss Everdeen, Rita Vertrasky, and Cassandra Anderson, to name but a few examples. One of my favorite parts in Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman, other than the epic No Man's Land scene, of course, was near the beginning, when the then-still-child Diana observes all the other Amazons training and started doing some punches herself. I felt, at that moment, that the creators of the film understood me, because that was what I used to do as a kid. To be fully honest, that is what I still sometimes do when nobody's around to see. Women do like to play with swords as well, and we want to be warriors and heroes. I will conclude this letter with this little gem, and while I really wish that I could have taken credit for it, it was written by someone on Reddit. Basically, the people in the thread were discussing the so-called male gaze and what it would be like to write a male character the way female characters have sometimes been written. And this is what they came up with. Hans groaned with a burly tone as he scratched the bountiful yet soft hair on his chest. Deciding it was time to give his powerful, well-toned abs a break, he propped himself up on his side with the healthy length of his erect penis acting as a kickstand. He blinked his striking blue eyes and ran his hands through his sandy blonde hair. Eyes finally focusing, he looked tenderly at the picture of his late wife and two children on the stand next to his cot. Shedding a single manly tear, he steeled himself to hide his sensitive nature that stood apart from the pack of brutes in the mercenary company he found himself with. How many men had died in the fight the previous night? How many babies would be born only to end up where he was? He pressed those questions from his mind as he picked up the only thing that dwarfed even his mighty package, his even mightier gun, and he set out for a day of badassing. Come on, someone turn this into a movie. You've already got my ticket. Best regards, Willow. You know what's interesting? I mean, I think that ultimately, I love seeing handsome, well-built men in movies. I enjoy seeing guys with big packages in porn. I mean, I like that. I like that idealized version of men. I like seeing good-looking, manly men that I can, dream of being. I feel the same way about women, and I think ultimately, maybe it's because, look, the male member, as much as I have enjoyed mine over the years, it's not exactly the most aesthetically pleasing thing, especially when he's not standing at attention. And I think that a woman's body, naked, there's just something more interesting for both sexes. It tends to be, I think beautiful. Of course, that's me as a white cis middle-aged male saying that. But I think that there's something almost more natural about curves, but that doesn't go to say that I don't love seeing idealized men. I mean, I think one of the reasons I love Two Moon Junction so much is that Richard Tyson is such a handsome dude. He's buff, he's got long hair, he's got big muscles, and I love watching him throwing Sherilyn Fenn around in Zalman King's masterpiece of softcore Southern erotica. I mean, come on. No, I think you're right. I mean, I think as we Yeah, but again, men and women come at things from different ways. It's not to say that women aren't as visual as men are, but I think there's a component to female sexuality that's a little different than men's. Although I don't want to denigrate the fact, or I think women are just as horny, if not more so, and just as dirty as men are. As a matter of fact, women are. I've learned far more imaginative things in bed or in romantic situations with women than on my own. Let me tell you that. So I know, but I think you're right. But again, it's an evolving part of civilization, and we are. It's a slow burn. It's a slow change, but we are changing as we come to as we sort of unfurl we let go of the shackles of the past and the mores, and when we finally do recognize that women are just as much of sexual beings, or they want to be just as heroic as their male counterparts, it's changing. But I think your letter is incredibly well taken, and I completely agree with everything you've written, as I usually do. We definitely, not only do we park our shuttlecraft in the same garage, I'd like to think you and I use the same shuttlecraft because we have so much respect for one another. That's what I like to think. But Willow, this was, again, another fantastic letter. If you want to read this letter again, or you'd like to comment on Willow's letter, please go to the Burnettwork.net website and find Willow Talk, where you can read all of Willow's musings, and I'd like to think that they all make us better people. Happy Console Gamer sent in a super chat saying, "Hey Robert, I just found your channel and love your insight on movies and geek culture in general. What happened to the Dune video? Copyright striked? Is it coming back?" Yes, for those who ask, I did do a video of my impressions of the script, Denis Villeneuve's, Eric Roth's, and John Spaihts' recent draft of Dune. Actually, it was written in 2018. And I gave my opinion, and the copyright strike, you can see what they object to on the video. They say, they objected to my opinion. They objected to my opinion, which I thought was really interesting. I don't think they got to the part later in the video when I was reading from the script. But they objected to my opinion, which I thought was very unfair for a copyright strike. Now, there are copyright notices and there are strikes. This was an actual, they gave me it wasn't until I put the video back up, I changed what I thought was their problem, and they came back again, and it's a strike against my channel, which is bad, people. If you're on YouTube, it's bad. So somebody was watching me, which, okay, I understand. And I was pushing it when I put up the video. I was being obstinate. I understand that, but I am going to put that episode back up on our website so people can go there, and hell, it'll drive traffic to the website, which is always a good thing. But I was bummed. People took it down. Calvi Bowles says, "Why do studios buy the rights to a book and then make a film that doesn't even resemble the book? Wouldn't it just be cheaper to write an original story?" Well, that's a good question. It's really hard to make a movie, and it's really hard to adapt a film, to make a movie out of a book. And I think that a lot of the time what starts happening is there are rules, there's screenwriting rules. Not all rules are made to be broken. But, books are difficult to adapt. They said that William Burroughs' Naked Lunch would be too difficult to adapt. Cronenberg did it. Now, it's a very liberal adaptation of his book, but they still did it. They said The English Patient couldn't be translated, but they did. And I think, when you start to realize it's hard to just go page by page and adapt a story in a book without making changes. Look at the differences between Peter Benchley's novel of Jaws and the finished film. The movie is a stripped-down version of the book. There's a lot of subplots that are left behind. So I think, look, great books have great stories in them, and I think the first impulse is, oh my God, that book was so great. Let's go make that into a movie. There's a book by a guy named Robert Goddard that is not a genre book at all, called In Pale Battalions. And even now when I think about it, in my mind, I'm like, God, I want to make that into a movie. It's not science fiction. It's not horror. It's a period piece. There's just something about that book I really like. But in trying to translate it, I don't know if it would be effective. I don't know if I would be good at translating that book. But I still think it is great. But it's a good question. It might be cheaper writing an original story, but even an original story is still hard to come up with. I mean, movies are so expensive now, you got to come up with a story that's worthy of spending tens of millions of dollars on. And that, my friend, is man, it's hard to do. Very, very hard to do. So, yeah, I just want to say that it's a good question, but as we all know, it is a risk to make movies. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to an end of Robservations episode number 337. I want to thank you for bearing with me. I very much want to thank Christopher Fagan for sending in that incredible video. And I want everyone to know, if you would like to send me videos, you can send them to me at the Burnettwork.net website. Or if you do like Christopher did, and you have your own channel and you want to make me a video and use your channel iconography so I can play it here, that is perfectly fine. He put his video up on YouTube, and I took it down from YouTube so I could play it on the channel. So that's always a possibility as well. I would just ask that if you're going to use YouTube, before you make the video public, I'd like to be able to play it here first and give me sort of maybe a week or two exclusive window where it just appears here. But thank you very much to everybody. I'd love it if you like these chats, please hit like, please hit subscribe, please hit the little notification bell so you know when I go on. And if people have topics they want to send in, letters, videos, that's what we are here for, to build this Post-Geek Singularity community, to share the thoughts of imagination connoisseurs all over the world. And with that, I want to first off thank the Honorable Mayor Mike Bodden, who administers the website. I want to thank my great moderators. I want to thank the great detective Jim Boyers. I want to thank the great Greg Smith, and of course Louis Yu. And I want to thank Jordy Lyons, who has had tragedy in his life. And if you interact with Jordy online, send him some good thoughts, tell him some funny jokes. He's a great guy, and we really appreciate the work that he does for the channel. As always, I will be back. I will not be on the John Campea show tomorrow because it is Thursday. He's got the ladies on Thursday. And why I don't get to be on with Aaron and Chris, I don't know, because I love them both. They are phenomenal women. They are strong, and they're funny and wicked smart. And I think John just is keeping them to himself because he's afraid of my power. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, remember, every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. And all you have to do is listen. And with that, I bring an end to Robservations episode number 337. And as I like to say, as always, have a better day.